and good morning. This is Andrew, and today we're going to be working a little bit more on this chess project. We're actually revisiting it. This is our second time revisiting it, and we're going to be doing castling, which we did piece promotion in the last video, so we're going to be adding on with another mechanic, and this is going to have a lot of code in it, so we're just going to start directly in Visual Studio and go ahead and get started. And we're going to be doing a bit of housekeeping within our piece manager and our pawn script. The first thing, believe it or not, during this entire project, I had the queen and the king flipped. And I don't know how I got through 8 videos and I managed to make that mistake, but when I had to start doing this castling thing and looking at how many pieces were between the king and the rook, I realized that I had screwed up. I don't know if anyone else seemed to notice, but I didn't get a comment about it, so we're all good on that front. But I guess I would also briefly just say you're going to need pretty much the whole project, the 1 through like the 8 videos that came before this, to start off from this point. If you don't, you should be able to get through it pretty quick, but this is just more specifically for people who requested it. So let's go ahead and go into our pawn script, because that's all we had to do within our piece manager. And we're going to be making a few changes here. So the first thing, before we actually start changing anything, let's go ahead and collapse all of these. And if we go and look at this reset function, we have an override here in our pawn that's overriding from our base piece. And the thing is, we're not necessarily going to need that anymore because we're going to be moving this is first move to our base piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and delete this reset. And before I forget, let's go ahead and collapse everything in our base piece as well. We're going to go to this reset and we're going to remove this virtual because we're not going to need to override it anymore. And then we're going to get our first move from our pawn. We're going to cut that and we're going to move that into our base piece as well. So we're going to just paste that. And for simplicity's sake, we're also just going to make it public. All right. And that's a little bit of the housekeeping. What we're actually going to do now is we're going to work a lot within the Rook class as well as the King class. And there isn't a whole lot here, but when we're done with it, there's certainly going to be quite a bit. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a few variables, and they're both going to hold cells. So we're going to be making a public cell that we're going to be calling castle trigger cell. And by the name, you may be able to guess what it's for. And it's basically the cell that the rook is going to be holding onto, that if the king lands on it after it's passed all of the checks that it needs to, it's going to initiate the castle. And once the castle has been initiated, we need a cell for this rook to go to, and we're going to be creating another cell for that. And we're just going to call that castle cell. We will also initialize that to null. And if you want to, just to be a little bit clean, I guess, or simplistic, we're going to hide an inspector so we don't have that variable in our inspector. One thing I believe we're also going to need to be doing as we're working through this is going between our base class so we can see what functionality we're going to need to override. And I think for the rook, we're only going to need to be overriding one thing. So if we go in here, back to our base piece, we're going to look at our place, where we're going to be setting up all of those, well, not all of those, that's quite grandiose. Those 2 cells we have for the rook, we're going to be setting up in the place. So we're going to be adding a virtual to this place function, and then we'll be overriding it in our rook. So let's go back to our rook. We're going to make a public override void place. And we're going to still be making a base call to that place. So it's going to do all this functionality right here. So it's going to handle all that cell stuff, as well as the transformation and the game object stuff. And then the 2 big things that we're going to be doing here is setting both of those cell variables that we created. So we're going to have our trigger cell, and we're going to have our castle cell. Cool. So, and then we're just going to need some integers for both of these. So enter, we'll be calling this one trigger offset. And I'll write this out and then I'll explain what it does. Actually, let's hold off on that for the time being. Let's just write this out. So here we're creating a new integer called trigger offset. And what we're doing is we're getting the current cell of our rook piece. We're getting its board position and its x value. And we're seeing if it's less than 4. And if it's less than 4, then we're going to set our integer to 2, or we're going to set it to -1. And what we're doing here is we're simply trying to figure out if this rook is on the left or the right side of the king. And we need to do that so we know which direction to be moving the king. And instead of trying to get the king and get its actual board position, we know that its x value is going to be 4. And if we go back into Unity, I'll just show you that really quick. So our X value here for the rook is 0, our knight is 1, our bishop is 2, our queen is 3, and our king is 4. So we're going to be getting that X value of 4, and if it's less, we know it's going to be this rook right here, and it's going to need to move this in this direction. And if it's greater than 4, then we know it's going to be this rook, and it has to move in this direction. So hopefully that makes sense. So now that we're back in Visual Studio, we're going to go ahead and create another one of these variables, and it's going to be the castle offset. And it's more or less the same logic, but we're just getting a different value for setting our castle cell. And for these values that it could return, it's going to be 3 or it's going to be -2. And before we finish this placement function, let's go ahead and write the signatures for our other functions. We're going to be making a public void castle, naturally, so due to the actual castling. And then we're going to be making another one called a private function. It's going to return a cell, and it's going to be called set cell, where we're going to be passing in an offset. And if you can tell, or seeing this already, we created these offsets so we can pass it into this set cell function. And we're going to be doing two things here. We're going to be creating a new position, and then we're going to be returning that value, or that cell. So right here, we're going to be creating a new variable that's going to be a vector2 int that we're going to call new position. And we're going to set that up with a value of our current cell's board position, and we're going to be getting the x value of this vector2, and we're going to be adding offset to it. So all we're really doing is, once we figure out that offset, we're just applying it to the current position of the rook, so we can get the cell that's either 2 spaces over or 3 spaces over, or if we're adding, and if we're subtracting, that's why it's a negative. And now we actually have to return a cell. So let's return. We're going to get the current cell of our rook. We're going to get the board, and then that board is going to contain all of the cells. And we're going to do new position.x and new position.y. And what that's going to do is going to take our new vector2 int, plug it into our board of all of our cells, and it's going to return it. Cool. So now that we have that, I think we'll move up. We'll do the castle, and then we'll move back up to place. So castle is pretty simple. We just have two things. We're setting a target and moving, and we're moving. It's pretty, like I said, it's pretty simple. We have our target cell, and then all we're doing is we're sending it to that castle cell. And the target cell is something that is set in the base piece when the player is dragging around the piece. So we need to set the target cell so we know what cell to move to. So once that's been set, we just call the move function. And that's basically it for that. And then we need to make a call to our set cell here, back in our place function. So we have our mCastle, trigger cell equals set cell, and we're passing in that offset value. Just make sure you're using the correct offset. So whatever you're setting for this trigger offset, you're also setting the trigger cell, and you're passing in the correct value. Because weird things would happen if you did if you got those mixed up. So we're also going to set our castle cell, and we're going to be passing in our castle offset. All right, and that about does it for the rook. That's not a ton of code, but a lot of it's going to be in the king. So I'm going to just sit here for just a second so you can look at it, and that's all we've added. Okay, so now let's go into the king. King doesn't have a lot right now, but he's going to have a lot when we're done with it. All right, so we're going to be creating 4 new functions. A couple of them are going to be overriding ones in our base piece, so they're not going to be too crazy, but we're going to need 2 functions that are very specific for the king. So the first thing that we're going to do is create an override for our check pathing. And what this is going to do is we're going to do the normal pathing for the king that does its horizontal, vertical, and diagonal movement. And then we're going to be doing all the checks to see if we can add any additional pathing for the castle. And then in that similar train of thought, we'll be doing the same for our move function in case we need to castle. We'll have to do those additional movements for the rook and all that good stuff. And then we have a couple of private functions specific for the king. And we have a function that's called canCastle. We're just asking if we can castle and passing in a rook. And we would return true for now. It's okay. And probably the most intensive thing for this entire project is going to be this get rook function. It could potentially be simplified in some ways, but it does what it needs to do, as well as gets the rook right when we need it, and doesn't store any, we don't have to deal with any values when this is not being checked, if that makes any sense. So there we go. We have all our signatures in place, and I think we're actually going to start on this get rook function first. It is the biggest thing, so once we get that out of the way, we're pretty solid. Let's write a few comments here so we can kind of pseudocode this out, because it is quite large. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to ask if the king has moved. So has the king moved? If he has moved, then we don't need to try and get a rook, because when you castle, neither of the pieces, if they had moved, then they can't castle. And we also need to check if there are any pieces in between the king and the rook, which is basically what this function is going to be doing. After has the kind moved? No, has the king moved? There we go. We're going to be getting the position of the king. We'll be going through the cells that lie between the king and the rook, because you have to see if there's a piece there, if there isn't a piece there. We're going to try and get a rook. So what it's going to do is we're going to check all the cells between the king and the rook, and if there aren't any, then we're going to get that last cell and check to see if it has a piece, and then we're going to see if the piece is friendly and see if it's moved and all that good stuff. Once we're going to try and get a rook, we're going to cast that piece that we get from the cell to see if it actually is a rook, and then we'll add castle trigger to movement. Okay, so this is where that cell that we created earlier within our rook script, scroll up here, this trigger cell is going to come into play. Because when a piece is moving, it has that highlighted cell list that's going to contain all the cells that it can move to. And what we're going to be doing is if it passes all these checks, we're going to be getting that castle trigger cell from the rook and adding it to that list as well. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's actually write some code. So first we're going to write an if statement where if the king is moved, then we're going to return null. And we're returning null because in this case, we need to return a rook. Or at least that's what we're looking for. And just to stay pretty clean, we're going to be making two integers for our current x and our current y. This is pretty self-explanatory. All right, so let's just copy that, paste that. So we have one for our x and one for our y value. Cool. And now let's go through. This is where we're going to be going through all the cells. And this is where these two arguments are going to come into play. I haven't necessarily talked about them just yet, but you'll see in just a second. So we're going to make a for loop where we're going to have our index I start at 1. I is going to be less than this count variable up here. And the count variable is basically going to be the number of pieces that lie between the king and the rook, because on the left side it differs from the amount of pieces on the right side, because the king isn't directly in the center of the board, it's further to the right actually. So then we're just going to want to iterate, which is going to be pretty simple. So a pretty standard loop. Now we're actually going to make our third offset variable of this entire video, where it's going to be the offset x. I'll explain this in just a second, because we're going to be using our direction here as well. And our direction is either going to be 1 or it's going to be -1, because sort of how we had to figure out before with the rook is figuring out, is it on the left or the right? And if it's on the left, it's going to be a positive value, but if it's on the right, it's going to be a negative value, because it has to subtract from the rook's x board position back to the king, so it's moving to the left. So in this case, we're going to go through all the cells on both the left and the right. And that lets us reuse this for loop for both of those instances by giving it this direction. So how the math would work out here is we get the current x of the king, and we're going to be adding to that. And it's going to be our index value. Let's say it's just 1 in this case. And then it's going to be the direction. So if it's a positive 1, then it's just going to be 1. But if it's a negative 1, then it's going to be a -1. And so on and so forth. So whether the value is 2 or 3, you probably get the picture at this point. So let's go ahead and make a cell state variable. And this is what's going to be holding the current state of the cell that we're going to be checking. So we're going to use our current cell to get our board, and we're going to be calling validate cell from our board script. And we're going to be passing in that offset x variable that we just created, along with a current y of our king, and the keyword this, which is going to be the checking piece, which we're the king. And then we're going to be writing an if statement here. And I'll explain it once I write it out. So like I said, what this for loop is doing is going through all of those cells. And if we encounter a cell that is not free, therefore it's not an active castle. You can't castle because there are pieces in the way, so we're going to return null. So we didn't get a rook from this. All right. So that's one of the more intensive parts. So now that we've done that, the rest is pretty simple. So now that we've kind of gone through all of those cells and there's nothing between them, we're actually going to get to that rook cell. But thing is, a rook may or may not be there, or another piece may be there. So we need to do all the checks to make sure that we're getting what we think is there. So we're getting all of our cells again to get the rook cell. We're using our current x, which is the position of our king, and we're adding to that. We're going to add the count. Again, the count is this integer here, and we're going to multiply that by the direction. And we're using our current y again. And if you remember, in this for loop, we used a less than sign. We didn't use a less than equal. So what we're doing is we're stopping just one shy of the rook cell. And that's what enables us to be able to simply add it to this current x. Because we actually haven't checked it yet. This just checks everything in between the rook and the king, not the rook itself. So hopefully that makes sense. So we're also going to make a rook that we're going to be storing and checking and making sure he's an actual rook. He's a real rook. I meant to say boy, but I think I just combined both of them. So we're going to be checking to see if it's a rook. So we're going to get our rook cell. We're going to get the current piece. We're going to use the keyword is, and we're going to be passing in the type rook. And if it is a rook, then we're going to be setting that variable that we just created. And we'll also be casting it by putting the type rook in these parentheses. And we'll do rook cell dot current piece. There we go. So at this point, we've gone through everything. We've gotten the cell for the rook. We've checked to see if it's a rook, and that's all fine and dandy and good. So now we're just going to double check and make sure that that rook is not equal to null. And we're going to add that highlighted cells.add rook. And we're going to be adding that castle trigger cell that we created earlier. But one thing I think we're going to want to do here is once we get that rook, we don't necessarily know if the rook that we're going to be getting is a friendly rook. We're just getting a rook. We don't know if it's part of the black team or the white team. And what we're going to need is to see if the rook matches the same color as the king. So we're going to kind of kill two birds with one stone here, where we're going to be checking to see if the rook matches the color of the king and if it has or has not moved yet. So we're going to have another if statement where we're going to have our rook. We're going to get the color of the rook. And if it's not equal to the color of the king, or it's not, or its first move is equal to false, then we're going to return null. Okay. And I think what we'll do is we'll actually just cut this out here. We'll bring that up, reformat that a little bit, and then we'll just add a return here. Because once we get beyond this point, we're gonna want to have a rook, basically. Because once we've got one, and once we've done a cast, essentially, then we want to say like, okay, this is the right rook. We're in the right place at this point. But one thing we'll probably also want to do is right before we cast it, we're probably going to want to see if the rook cell even has a piece. So let's make another if statement. So our rook cell dot m current piece is not equal to null, because we'll probably get an error if we're trying to cast an object that does not exist. Okay. And let's add another comment here. Return if no rook. And then we'll check color and movement. Okay. So we're doing a lot there. It's quite a bit, but I think it's done for the most part. We just need to check at the very bottom here instead of returning null. Finally, we're actually going to be returning the rook. All right, so hopefully that all works out for us. So we're just going to need to edit these two functions and we're good to go. And so continuing on our downward up trajectory, we're going to be working on this can castle function. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be, once we call a can castle and we're giving it a rook, we're just going to see if we have a rook. So if rook is equal to null, then we're going to return false. And all we're really doing in this can castle is we're checking values from the king with the rook itself. And if you wanted to, you could probably move this down to this section here, but you know, you're more than welcome to. And I'm kind of feeling like I should just do that right now, because at this point, you know what, let's do that. I'm making decisions as I'm programming. I probably shouldn't do that. But let's scroll down here. And because we've already done a lot of the work here, so we may want to just, all we really have to do at this point is checking to see if the rook's color, not the rook's color, but the rook's trigger cell matches the current cell of the king. But actually we can't do that. We actually can't do that yet. Let's leave it like it is. Let's not get too adventurous. Let's go ahead and just do that here, because we actually need to do this once it's moved. And you'll kind of see that in just a second. Let me write this out because I'm kind of meandering at the moment. So let's get our rook that we're passing into this function, and we're getting the castle trigger cell. And we're going to see if it's not equal to our current cell, then we're going to return. We're going to return false, that is. So because this, when we're checking our pathing, we're going to check the path, add the highlighted cells, but once we move, we're going to be checking the new position of our king with this castle trigger cell. So it's a bit of a two-step process. It's the check pathing, and once the path has basically been selected, then we're moving. So that's a good way of just making that distinction. So we may want to change this function to something else, or you may, so it's a little bit more descriptive, because it's a bit generic at the moment. All right, so we're almost done. We just have to finish out these two overriding functions, and we're done. So I guess the question is, are we gonna abandon? Yeah, no, let's continue. We're not gonna abandon our downward up progression. So we're gonna be calling can castle, where we're gonna be passing in a rook. But before we do that, let's comment that out. We're gonna be needing two specific references to rooks for the king, because we're gonna be setting them in check pathing, and we're gonna be checking them in move. So we're gonna make a private rook that we're going to be calling left rook, initializing that to null. And then another private rook. It's going to be our right rook. And it's also going to be set to null. Okay, cool. So let's set those. Let's just go ahead and set those. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. So we're going to be setting our right rook, and then we'll be setting our left rook. And this is where we're going to be making a call to that get rook function down here, where we're going to be passing in a direction and a count for that for loop. So we're going to be getting our right rook. We're going to be calling get rook, and we'll be passing in 1. Like I said, it's going to be a -1 or a +1. In this case, it's a +1. And the count. So it's going to be 3. Because there are 3 pieces, or 3 cells between the king and the rook on the right side of the king. And then for the left, we're going to be setting our left rook, get rook, and we'll be passing in -1 and 4. Actually, I don't think that's right. I think I flipped those by accident. So let's cut that. This may come back to bite us, but I think it goes like that. That makes a bit more sense. So let's go ahead and actually let's actually take a second and go into Unity so we can look at this side by side. Okay, so we're going out from our king, and if we're going to get the left one, then we're going to be moving negatively. And if we're going to get the one on the right, then we're moving to the right. Okay, so I think I was right the first time. So let's go ahead and undo this. See, that's what happens if you don't have a visual aid and you're just kind of thinking about it. So to go from our king to our left rook, we have to move negatively. So we're starting at 4. We're going to negative, not negative 3, but we're going to 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And then we're going to be going from our king, we're going to go 1, 2, 3. So that's what the 3 is for. Because like I said, when we use that less than, we're only going to be checking the values 1 and 2 essentially, because we're starting that for loop at 1. So we'll go 1, 2, and we're just checking those 2. And then we're going 1, 2, 3, and we're just checking those 3. And if those are all clear, that's when we're going to be getting that rook cell. So sorry about that confusion. Let's go ahead and maximize this. And let's go ahead and finish up this code down here in our move function, because that's actually all we have to do for our check pathing. So let's do put in our left rook that we're going to be passing into our can castle, because once we've done all the checking and got the rook, we just need to see if the cell that the king ended up landing on is matching our trigger cell. All right, so then we're going to get our left rook, and we're going to call castle, that function we created earlier. Let's also add some comments here. Let's just call this left, and we'll just call this right. Not that we need those, but you know, just for visibility's sake for the time being. So we're going to call can castle, and we'll be passing in our right rook. Not castle. Okay, oh my goodness, I think we're done. It'll be a miracle though if this works the first time, because I did move a few things around while we were doing that. So let's go ahead and go back into Unity and see if this works. All right, so let's hit play and let's see what happens. Okay, so we're gonna need to first move these 2 pieces out of the way. So let's move some pawns around the board so we can get that all fine and dandy. Let's move our bishops, our knights. Oh, I actually uncommented that, so that's okay. That's okay for right now. All right, so when we click the king, we don't have our cell. No, it didn't work. So let's actually go back into Visual Studio and see what we messed up. I think it's most likely in the king, where I started changing some things down here because I just thought it would be better, and I'm pretty sure I added a few of these null checks because I don't think I fully bug tested this. So I think it's actually this null. So let's go ahead and check that, because it says if it is not null, then let's return nothing, which doesn't make sense. If it's null, then let's return null. So I think that hopefully fixed it. So let's try this again. Okay, so let's move these pieces out of the way. Let's move our bishops, let's move our knights, and hopefully this cell highlights. It does, and yeah, see, there you go, and it castled. Cool. And now let's do it for this side, so you see if that side works as well. And then let's move the queen, let's just move her, let's move the bishop, move the knight, and you can see that this cell is now highlighted. That's one further away than its normal. You can also move to this one, seeing as that this is open as well. But if we go there, the rook moves to the correct place. So there we go. I know that was probably a lot, and this is probably a long video, but if you got all the way through it, congratulations. If you need any help, feel free to leave a comment. I check those pretty regularly. If you are interested in learning anything else or a particular project, feel free to leave a comment about that as well. But hopefully I'll see you around.